Hi everyone, I'm pilwyc-fastec, and I'm going to be talking to you about identities for the smart home, an urbit discussion for self-sovereign IoT. And as you may know, urbit includes an identity that's known as azimuth. And as part of the system, there's very strong pseudo-identities that are scarce, and there's only about 4 billion of them. And this is all on a blockchain. And this does not, though, include strong reputation, or at least it's not something that is part of the system today in a very overt way. And it's really up to people to decide, right? So the way that we end up deciding someone else's reputation is what goes on inside of our own heads based on our ability to see their identity, which is their peep hat or something like that. And so, as I said, I'm pilwyc-fastec, and so I'm someone that has worked in the technology industry for a very long time. I've been very focused and very interested in the way that computing becomes more of the homes and offices and just in general the spaces that are part of our world. And what I'd like to do is to really start with what I'll talk about as communal computing. And so communal computing is, a concept that I would align with things like ambient computing, ubiquitous computing, pervasive computing. Basically, this idea that for anything else that we're not pulling closer and closer to our face, right? So VR goggles, iPhones, whatever else, we are now pushing further into our environment. And so that means into the walls and devices that already exist inside of, say, the home. And a good example of that would be the idea of the smart light bulb. And so this is an example of a WISE smart light bulb, but during the studies that we ended up doing that I'll talk about in a moment, a lot of urbit users also had things like Philip Hue smart light bulbs. And so smart light bulb itself is something that can be controlled usually by apps through third-party services, sometimes through light switches that are in the actual home or office. And what's really important about this is that when I talk about communal computing is that there are many different people that may actually interact with this light bulb, right? So there could be me, there could be my wife, there could be my kids, even people like my mother-in-law, guests, people that are cleaning the house, or even the UPS delivery person could eventually interact with these devices. And it could be through direct interaction, right? So I could control one of these things through an app that I have on my phone. The people that live in the house could use a light switch that I've wired up to use this. They could use a home assistant to do that by giving it a command. And it could also even be controlled by something like a motion detector that whenever someone comes to the front door, the light automatically turns on. So I guess my only point here about these light bulbs and about the world of communal computing is that there's a lot of different ways that people will interact with these devices, and they have varying kind of beliefs about what types of privacy and security, even things like experience and ownership that comes over these types of things. And so that leads us to the Alexa device and other types of home assistants, which is one of the key ways that people will interact with various services. And the ones with screens could even talk about the idea of like photos that are in my home. Something that recently came out for a Google Home Hub was that you could start to use the camera that's on a Google Home Hub as another security camera within your home. And so you can actually start to then look inside of places where it would be like, say, a kitchen. Something that just happened recently, as of yesterday, Amazon has put out an offer to buy Roomba. I think it was for $1.7 billion. Basically, the iRobot group that ends up building Roomba. They do have something called the Astro, which has a face on it and a screen with a video camera. But I think this gets to maybe a disturbing thing that a lot of people have noticed with client-server architecture is this idea that there's tons of data that's being sent to third parties that we really have no control of. But what's really important about that is that it's not only our data, but it's our family's data or people that we end up living with. And so I think this is like a really important aspect of technology, and these types of devices are going to become more and more prevalent as time goes on. So the goals of the grant that we actually just completed were a couple things. So one, you can go and look up the grant here if you want to. Basically about how do we start to think about communal identities and what does that mean? And so there were, especially in the home. And so one of the things was to really understand this intersection of the smart home with the current urbit community. Second thing was to really learn about identity, privacy, security, experience, and ownership concerns with current smart home solutions. And then, start to understand there's a whole field or industry that talks about this idea of self-sovereign identity, decentralized identifiers. How familiar are people with that topic? And then are they familiar with things like the concepts? Do they care about these types of things? And so over the course, then finally, we want to document kind of what does ongoing maintenance concerns look like with smart homes? So not just the idea of, say, setting up or purchasing a device and how people think about that, but also just ongoing, what happens over time as new people end up moving in and out of the house, when they move houses, when a piece of software is reset or an over-the-air update comes into a device. So we ended up doing about 12 user interviews that were pulled out about 236 nuggets, which is really just a term to mean like a piece of research that is valuable in some way. And we coded these into problems, solutions, privacy, identity, smart home, and wishes. We did 3 workshops with the communal computing urbit community, and then did 3 expert and technical interviews to pull together a white paper. And so this basically some of the key insights that came out of this, especially from the standpoint of urbit smart home users, was one is that people are split on whether a single urbit identity is a good thing. And what I mean that is that like pilwyc-fastec, right, is an identity that I'm going by here that's a pseudo-anonymous identity. But I also have other identities that I go by, which would be my work identity, my family home identity. If I'm part of a PTA or I'm part of a poker group or online gaming, those are all different identities that I could potentially assume, right? And some of them have shared things like my name, but some of them do not, right? Like I haven't really cross-pollinated pilwyc-fastec in my personal identity, partially because the way where I do work, there may be considered to be a conflict of interest. And so from that perspective, I think that idea of having one centralized identity, I think in a lot of the words of the urbit users is that you're kind of, if you have one identity, you end up being kind of cancelable to a certain extent. And so this concept of having one identity, some people thought about it being is very valuable, and some people didn't think it was very valuable, and they wanted to have multiple identities. My hypothesis, just based on the people that we ended up interviewing, and again, it's a sample size of 12, was that once you start to actually live with other people, and so that could be a spouse, a partner, children, a multi-generational family, you start to want to have this type of split of identity. Before that, though, people tend to assume one single identity overall. And so I think there's like age and your family situation ends up kind of being an important aspect of this. The second thing is that everyone wants to control the flow of the information from their home devices, right? So this across the board, people wanted to be able to like understand what data was coming out of it and know where it was going. And so I think this is very much related to a quote that is maybe appropriate for Roomba, but this idea of, that your devices can be controlled by someone else, or, I don't know, who in China is driving my vacuum around at night. And so this was actual quote from one of the people that we interviewed. But there's this real concern that, especially when we talk about the idea of commodified devices, we really don't know where those endpoints are that the data is being sent to. And so as an example, I think I saw this recently where there's this thing called a flipper, which is like hacking device, being able to take out these types of devices. So not just the idea of like, where is my data going, but am I able to actually control it in a way that is meaningful and turn things off, for example. The third thing is that major life events cause changes in device use, and then probably identity fracturing. And so I kind of mentioned that earlier about the identity fracturing when, say, like someone moves in or they move to a bigger house or they have children. That's what I mean by kind of major life events. But also that's when people will choose to, in some cases, disable devices, right? So if they may have had a bunch of video cameras previously, the moment they have a child, they start to worry about this idea of data about their child going off to a third party. They will, in some ways, just remove all of those cameras. Also, the idea of moving between places, sometimes just resetting up a device is actually pretty hard for people to do. The fourth thing is that there is this added complexity of identity when living with someone else, or even having guests over, right? So what does it mean for someone, to have a spouse? And, I think like one of the issues I've had is I have 4 kids, and 2 of them know how to use the Google Home Hub to play Spotify music. And so what this does is it creates, well, one, behavioral data that Spotify collects about me is assumed to be all of this data. And so my playlists start to get skewed because of that. But it also means that, so do I need to now set up specialized identities or accounts for that device, because I know that someone in the kitchen, anybody that goes into that kitchen, which includes, a mother-in-law, my wife, my kids, could actually change this. And so it's not only just the idea of like concern around security and privacy, but this idea of like now the experience that I have is actually impacted in some way for these types of smart home devices. And then same thing with the idea of like even video recording. There were kind of mixed feelings about this idea of if someone were to come over for a dinner party, are they allowed to opt in or out from being video recorded, for example? And same thing with, say, like the UPS delivery person, should they be able to opt in to having their likeness actually recorded? And there's been a suit that took place in the UK where a neighbor that was across the street from a house that had a video doorbell was suing the neighbor for basically video recording them. So there's a lot of not only like privacy regulation issues that are starting to come up. The EU is doing a lot of things. Individual states like California are starting to do more around this. And it's going to be increasingly harder and harder and more of a patchwork of regulation, but also this idea of like norms, right? So there's this term, there's this kind of body of work around a privacy framework called contextual integrity by Helen Nissenbaum in a book, Privacy in Context. And so this idea is that what are the norms that are actually dictating the way that people think about data in this particular case? And then the fifth one was really that they had almost no familiarity with the self-sovereign identity community standards, any of that type of stuff, right? They were very much into urbit. There were a lot of people that were very urbit centric, but they didn't really know much about identity topics when it came to the outside world. So what is urbit in the smart home, right? I think there's a couple different places that we can start to target. And so if we look at the smart home as where there's a couple different things, mostly because of the client server architecture, there's this third-party cloud that exists. There's some type of internet router that usually is set up that provides people with Wi-Fi, with some type of network to the outside world. There's a smart home hub, and then there's multiple devices. And so here I've just drawn things like a security camera, a smart light bulb, and maybe a door lock. We can, in the white paper, we kind of discuss the different points that we may want to control more of our data within the home. And probably the most important one long term will be something like the internet router. The issue will always be with smart home devices is that there will be a plethora of manufacturers that may or may not observe and respect your request for how data is actually managed or not. Right? Both Amazon and Google more recently have admitted to the fact that for things like their video doorbells or security cameras, they will provide video clips to police officers or police organizations without actually requiring a warrant. And so I think that is the ideal place, is the internet router. Now, unfortunately, because of the way that Urbit is architected today, that's probably not in the near term. So the next aspect is potentially something like the smart home hub. And the smart home hub today could be things like a virtual assistant, or sorry, not a virtual assistant, but like a home assistant type of device. There are some open standards that are starting to come out around something called Matter, which is by the CSA, and Google and Amazon and I believe Apple and a couple other groups have all joined this particular association to allow for not only controllers that could come from any manufacturer, but also the fact that any device that actually follows that standard of Matter and Thread can then become, part of any smart home, and so they can all start to work together. So I think that's interesting, and the hub standard is probably not going to be publicly published until later this year, but that's I think another place. And then the third option is, and a third option is to actually just start making smart devices, and so like the Urbit light bulb would be something that we could potentially have. Again, we would need to have reference hardware. We would need to, make it so that it's small enough to be able to fit on these type of microcontrollers. The recommendation that we're actually giving in this case as a stepping stone towards better understanding how Urbit might fit into the smart home is a fourth option, which is really building out a Gall app that will allow for control of a smart light bulb, but we'll still have to create some type of outside of Urbit system to be able to interact and interface with the third-party services like Philips, Hughes, service basically. But then open sourcing it so that we can add additional, not only light bulb types, for example, but also other types of devices, and then eventually the idea of integration with Matter, so that Urbit could become a controller as more of a smart home hub. But that's kind of where we're thinking about it for the next grant that we're going to be proposing soon. So the white paper is available, and I put a short link here, just Urbit Smart Home on Bitly if you want to check it out. It's about 17 pages long, I think. But we kind of go through a lot of stuff I just talked about. There's some additional information about kind of what we're going to be doing for our next grant proposal. There will be a blog post that I'm told will come out on Monday, kind of about this. But I think one other thing I wanted to, and then just that this next step is to actually do another Urbit grant to create a smart bulb app to be able to control smart light bulbs from your Urbit instance. One last topic I wrote a blog post about that's going to be coming out on the Urbit blog on Monday is really about this idea of like reputation and legibility. And so as I mentioned before at the beginning, right, Urbit has a lot of strong identity types of thinking, but basically just leaves reputation up to each individual human, right? So like if you see pilwyc-fastec on a particular community, that's just my identity. That's a marker to kind of show there. And there's some way that I'm given access to different communities. But the truth is that the reputation that I have as pilwyc-fastec is actually built inside of your individual heads. And I think this gets back to the idea of legibility from the standpoint of that reputation, when encodified inside of these third-party services, ends up collapsing down a lot of the complexity of how I may have, say, multiple identities or the nuance around those identities. Because of basically intra relationships or intergroup relationships that I end up having. And so there was a really great post by Gordon Brander just like I think about 2 weeks ago called Soul Binding Like a State. And I think this is getting at like why this client server architecture and integration with third-party services are not only hazardous for us as individuals, but I think when we start to take it to the scale of the internet, it becomes really bad for us. And so that's why I think like Urbit has a real interesting opportunity to, one, continue to not, I think, my recommendation would be that we don't invest very much into reputational encoding systems, and that we still kind of focus on this idea of very strong identity. But the fact that we are now able to own our data and ideally own the data that's going in and coming out of our household, I think then also does a better job than the current services that are available today to basically provide a way for all of the identities within the smart home to also make more sense to people. And so I wanted to leave it there and just do like a really short talk about this, but I'd love to have a little bit of time to discuss, and I have a couple questions that I think are interesting that I'd love to ask people here. One is how does identity at the core of an OS really change identity use? How do you use reputation not only within Urbit but within your home potentially? How do the norms actually get affected there? Where should Urbit be in the smart home? And then what other questions should we be asking really? And if you go to the communal computing on Urbit community, I have links to some of this stuff, but these are kind of background links if you're interested in doing more. And what does the Roomba feel about dog shit? That was a talk that my other identity did at South by Southwest that ended up using kind of animism, like basically digital animism and role play to be able to figure out how devices should work with each other. So with that, I will just say thank you, and would love to hear any questions that people have, and then also just like thoughts on all this stuff. So I'll stop there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, give it up. It does look like we do have some questions. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Perfect. Questions? Did you? Questions? Jay, sorry. Here you go.
Hi, thank you for the really exploring the area that not a lot of people are exploring. How much do you think is worthwhile pursuing now? Meaning getting to a point where you have just light bulbs turning on and off versus waiting until you have a proper framework to actually build something meaningful and useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now a lot of the Urbit project is just helping people realize that urbit is something that you can do a lot of things with. So I guess one of my motivation would be to do something that's, even if it's kind of hacky right now, I think it's valuable. And I would argue that actually everything in the smart home, because of the fact that there's commodified technologies that are like lowest cost to entry type of things, that you're always going to be hacking one thing or another when it comes to the home. So I guess I would be, I think the next grant of going after kind of a very simplistic, just kind of proof of concept thing, I think is good. I would say that the grant after that, though, once Matter starts to become more of a real standard, there's more devices out there, I think we end up getting a lot of benefits by integrating with that type of standard. I don't think that we're quite ready yet, though, when it comes to building out urbit as hardware. It feels like, I know there's lots of people that are working on that, and there's lots of great work being done there. But I would just say that like the super small microprocessor use of urbit is probably a long way off. And so that's what I would say. So I definitely think we should be moving forward with like even proof of concept stuff right now. That's what I would argue. Yep, thank you for the question. What do you think, actually?
The around different individual identities, specifically in the home, interacting with smart devices and sort of like ways particular to that individual, I thought was very interesting, and it makes me think a little bit about the use of smart devices and connected devices in shared public spaces, and how individual identities might want to interact sort of more broadly. So curious if you have any thoughts there, or if that's an area, obviously more sort of speculative probably, but if that's an area that you've spent any time thinking about.
Yeah, so I'm an adjunct professor at a design school as well as like a technology professional. And so one of the projects that we did this last semester was really this like mixture of public and private spaces. And so some of the projects that the students took on was like, how would you reimagine the idea of like services for a beach, or services for a community playground, or one of them chose even a bank, right? Which I at first I didn't think of it as like a public-private type of place, but it does have like fairly public aspects to it. And so I think there's like one of the things that they came across in the bank when they were doing some prototyping and then user research was, how much information on a large screen should people be inputting, right? It's like to get in line at the bank, and how much information will they want to display there is a very interesting question, because I probably don't want like my bank account statements and my name and things like that being showing up on like a really large screen. And so I think there's a lot of work to do around that. I do think though that this is where kind of the contextual integrity question around what are the norms that are kind of governing this space come in. And so one of the examples that Nissenbaum brings up in her book is really around Google Street View, right? And so the norms of me walking down the street and seeing the front of houses makes a lot of sense, because that's just normal. Maybe not in gated communities or where there's like the horrible like next door people that are constantly talking about people walking around their neighborhoods, but for the most part, like just walking down the street on a sidewalk and looking at houses, that's completely acceptable. The problem that comes up is that there were no norms around the fact that anybody from anywhere around the world could look at the front of my house, right? And so that breaks this set of context, which is the only people that could really do it were people that drove down the street or walked down the street. Whereas now it's like literally any individual that has an internet connection can see the front of my house. And so I think that's where norms really come in around this. And there's different norms, right? Like, so in different places around the world, there's very different kind of like personal space is something that is very different around the world, right? What information, what types of questions to ask in public is or to someone that you just meet is very different around the world. And so I think we have to get to norms, right? That is definitely like a very interesting place. But I mean, there's plenty of communal devices that exist in the world, like ticket machines for the subway, right? Or the idea of like even billboards and advertisement. Those are communal devices in some way. And so, anyways, I think there's lots and lots of work to do there still. But that idea of like the public kiosk is definitely a very interesting one. I would just always point back to that, like, what are the norms that usually are dictated here? And norms can change though too, right? Like the norm that has changed in my household is that, I have like two picture frame. I bought my mom a digital picture frame so she can see pictures of the kids, and I control the the account that is linked to not only the picture frame in my house, but also the picture in hers. What ends up being very odd, though, is if like suddenly my, like say Facebook memory pictures from college suddenly started showing up on her device, even though it's my account, that would be really problematic because it breaks this norm set. But there is a new norm here, which is that she is just going to see random photos that I end up putting in that photo stream of the kids, basically. So norms are adjusting over time, but it really is about like human to human. Like all technology is just intermediation, right, between people. And so I would just argue that like when we think about this stuff, we should be thinking about it from the standpoint of like, and this is again, the contextual integrity framework talks about like who's the sender and receiver of information, because if the sender, like the receiver and sender, is actually incredibly important. So like the idea of say a medical records, right? Me sending my medical records to my doctor makes complete sense. But if you reverse that, even like the doctor sending me their medical records doesn't make sense. So there this contextualness, this like the norms that are dictating that are really, really important in that case. So anyways, I think it's a really interesting place to study, and definitely more needs to be done there. Thank you for the question.
So long ago, Steve Mann did a sort of study on, or rather, like he created this concept of surveillance where you're watching, or you're also watching the state as just as much as state is watching you. And earlier you showed a picture where there's a device that disables one of those robot dogs, and right, that one. And so to what extent, like, do you foresee where the forcibly like negotiating that protocol should be allowed versus not? Like, meaning like, let's say I go to someone else's house and I don't want my face seen and they know me. Like, how do you envision that in the future? I mean, in a very distant future, right?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I mean, I think like there was a great paper about Project Aria that was coming out from Facebook, which is the glasses that were really the early, like a very early version to test out some norms types of things around AR glasses in the future. And so Dr. Sally Applin, I think also with Fink, I think is the other author's name, wrote a really great kind of comparison of the issues around this. And I think your point around this is that we can privatize as much data as we want, or even the idea of like federated or distributed learning to do a better job of like not sending all of our data to a third party to then get advertising. It's still about coercion, right? It's still about this like lack of consent for what is happening. And so I think longer term, right, if we start to think about this idea of my data is my data, and I can make choices about how my data is used, even on other people's devices, for example. I think there's like two ways to go about it. So one would be like, if I imagine, I put together like prototypes of this to think about like what would be like a privacy preserving version of a video doorbell, right? And I think by default, what it would do is there's this kind of balance, right, between I want to know what's happening outside my door. I want to know when there's a package. I want to know a bunch of these things. But the identity of, say, my UPS delivery person, that's not probably something that I don't need. And honestly, that UPS delivery person, they want to do their job, but unless you're a person that's sitting out there on the like the porch looking at them, there's like a weird norm that they probably don't want to be known to you, right? Like they don't want you to be able to go to their home and know who they are. And so I think like the ideal video doorbell actually will automatically try to detect, right, like do things like face detection, and in some way, I think block the identities of other people that have not opted in to being video recorded. Now, there's this other concern then, what happens when there's crime, right? And I want to use something to say evidence, and usually it's punitive or like after the fact rather than the idea of actually stopping things. I mean, there's been a bunch of studies about video doorbells and how much they have actually helped, one, stop crime, and then two, actually arrest people afterwards. It's very unknown, right? Like it's probably not much of an effect. And so what I would say then, though, is that like you do want to have some recourse potentially. And so this idea of like blocking people's identities, maybe that means you're actually encrypting or like putting an overlay over people's faces, unless there's actually some type of investigation, a warrant, right? You end up like, and I would say whoever the local law official is, not just police, but maybe you work through like an I always say that word, but you know what I mean, like a local elder that helps like resolve conflicts, right? And they have a key, you have a key, and the doorbell has a key. And the only time that you end up actually decoding that type of face ends up being when there's an investigation and all of those different keys come together. And so I think there's something interesting about that. I think when it comes to like AR glasses long term as well, I think there will be some way for you to say, like, here's my opt-in or opt-out default status that is broadcast in some way. And there's been some interesting like sci-fi treatments about like how is it that you decide what types of like rules you adhere to or not. Could be something, you know, like even like the idea of like Diamond Age, right? They talk a lot about that you go to these like enclaves and then you obey their rules. And so maybe the rules are this idea of even a distributed state on top of the world, right? Is something that you could do. So I think that's like the direction it will go. I think we do need to build more privacy aware devices. And I think we need to do a better job of controlling the data that comes out of these devices. Unfortunately, because of like the drive for data collection by a lot of these companies, I think as long as there's a client server architecture, that's probably not the case. We're not gonna be able to rein that in. So anyways, that's, I think long term, there will be this idea of like, what is your default kind of, it's kind of like the idea, you know, people in some work contexts will like create like, you know, it's like the idea of like an out of office message or like the manual with dealing with me or the .plan file. I was just listening to a podcast with like John Karamak. And so like he was talking about how like in like, you know, his .plan was like his current status of thinking about things. So I think there's like all those like patterns I think will exist in some way in those kind of like, in those privacy situations. It's just whether people can still take copies of data though, right? Because like, I think what's interesting about a lot of these systems is that they are air gapped in some way from the standpoint of like a video recorder. If I build my own, I can do whatever I want with that. And that means including to collect your data, right? And same thing with even with like Urbit, like you can take a screenshot of what people said even after they have maybe deleted their messages. So that's all I'd say is like, I think there's some interesting issues around this, but it comes down to norms again. Like it's bad form to take a screenshot of something. It doesn't mean that bad actors won't do it though.
Right. Yeah, I really like your take on like multi-sig type of solution for unlocking, like, you know, kind of blurred out faces. I think that's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think like, again, I think this gets back to the idea that, you know, I don't want necessarily the police to have access to these cameras either by default, right? But I do want them to be valuable when it is appropriate. And that should go through some type of process that we've agreed to as a culture or society, right?
Yeah, awesome. Any other questions?
I have one more question. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Yeah. I thanks for fielding so many questions. So I worked in IoT space before. I think we actually chatted over so I'm one of the interviewees. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of get your take on is, you might have covered it earlier, the devices that are going to interact with future Urbit IoT system. They might try to phone home themselves, you know, because they need, you know, there's some sort of like analytics data or whatever it is that they need to send over to. How do you envision Urbit for preventing that sort of shenanigans? Or is there a no satisfactory solution and therefore, looks like we have someone dropped off. Yeah. Yeah. There you go. Yeah, of course. Are you back?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think something happened to my internet. I'm on my mobile phone now, so sorry about that.
No problem. Okay. So yeah, where I left off was, do you envision Urbit IoT framework as something that acts like a filter, so sort of like a reverse firewall, so that it doesn't send out all the, you know, analytics data or things that you don't want to be sent out? Or do you envision a future where we, you know, we have to create a IoT devices that are compliant with way in which we want the interaction to exist.
Yeah, I think Matter and Thread will they have a lot of assurances around security of like connections and things like that, but they don't really talk very much about the privacy aspects of that. So even in the internet standards that are coming out of the CSA, there's not really like a good understanding of privacy. So I think the long-term goal of Urbit, especially if it's going to be like your home computer type of thing, I think controlling which things can talk to what outside of your home, I think will be very valuable. So you could imagine, and if anybody's ever used something like Eero for like a mesh network, you can do a lot of controlling of like, one, which devices are connecting or not connecting, right? Which ones get actual internet or not. And some of the cases, like for example, like making sure that your TV never has an internet connection, right, is one of those things that gets harder and harder to do, because like even groups like Samsung are sending back data about your watching habits, even though you do not want them to, right? And they're actually, I think, I can't remember who it was, but someone was making like, they were making as much money from selling the data as they were selling TVs at that point. So I think like the control as the internet router of not only like which things are sending signal and where, right? Like to which services do you approve of these services, but also how often and how much. And so I think of that, like, I think longer term, I think there should be, I think that's the right place for Urbit to be, is to be that like internet router ideally. But again, it's like, how does that stuff fit into the longer term plans of Urbit and the way that the technologies work and stuff. So I think that's still TBD. But yeah, I think it should have like, there should be an app which is like control my network. What is all the data being sent?
Awesome. Any other questions? All right, let's give it up for pilwyc-fastec, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, and again, please join. We don't have a lot of stuff going on in the community right now, but like if there are more questions or people have anything they'd like to add, please do join the community and love to hear from you. So thanks.